Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me for our regular update from what's happening here in Washington. Before we get to that, though, I want to express my condolences to the folks in Maine, where the shooter, unfortunately, is still at large. I don't know any of the facts. I've not had a chance to get any briefing, but it's crazy in my mind that these kind of shootings continue to happen in our country. And while lots of elected officials offer thoughts and prayers, we still can't find a rational way to get particularly weapons of war off the streets. But I'm hopeful law enforcement will bring this perpetrator to justice. Obviously, the sooner the better. Moving to news of the week, it appears now that we have a new Speaker of the House of Representatives. I don't know Speaker Johnson, I believe is his name. I've not met him. I am a little concerned that it seems like what was partly the way that he was elected was because of I think, some of his positions that concerned me greatly. The fact that he was willing to overturn the 2020 elections, the fact that he has spoken out so vehemently against women's health care choices, the fact that it feels like on virtually every issue, from protecting Social Security to Medicare to standing by some of the most outrageous claims that former President Trump made, he seems to be out of that mold. Now, I owe him and the House the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps this new leadership position will bring him new responsibility and a more temperate view, because the House has got to get to work. We're less than a month away from another government shutdown, and it is really important that the House and us in the Senate do our job and act on the president's national security request. We need to get additional military aid to our friends in Israel. We need to not walk away, and we do need to continue to fund the brave soldiers and people of Ukraine against the authoritarian aggression coming from Putin and the Russians. We need to make sure that we all can do all we can to shore up our possibilities in the Indo-Pacific and put a big warning in terms of making sure that China doesn't take preemptive action in any area. And part of that as well means supporting our friends in Taiwan. So the House, after these weeks of antics, needs to get its act together, do its job, just as we have to do our job in terms of providing the security that's needed and making sure the government doesn't shut down. And on one item on the security, I think it's really important that the president included in this package humanitarian aid. The truth is, we can still have sympathy for the innocent Palestinian citizens. That doesn't have to translate into any kind of appropriate that doesn't translate into any kind of sympathy, though, for Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and we make ourselves stronger, and frankly, Israel stronger, if we make sure that the innocent citizens in Gaza, and increasingly as the bombing increases in the West Bank, that those individuals have basic humanitarian aid, so that when Israel does take out Hamas, that it doesn't end up resulting in even more terrorists born out of that violence because they were not provided adequate food and water during these challenging times. Two last comments, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. One is I joined a couple of other colleagues again this week in contacting the Department of Labor. We still have a real problem in this country in terms of child labor. We see it in some of our poultry processing plants, even in Virginia. We see it out in the Midwest in some of the pork facilities and other agricultural facilities. There's a reason, as far back as over 100 years ago, when America said we're not going to put 8 and 10 and 12-year-olds to work in unsafe conditions. It is remarkable in my mind that we've seen some backsliding on that, particularly with migrant children. And I want to make sure that we hold DOL to task in terms of doing its job. And then finally, a bit of good news. The administration announced two tech hubs this week. Virginia received 2 of, I believe, the 31 that were announced. One is based in the New River Valley, that's around additive manufacturing, which is much more of how do you produce at a better value, high-tech manufacturing across a host of fields, defense in particular, but across a host of fields. And then we also received another tech hub designation for the Richmond-Petersburg area, something that we'd received prior federal funding for, both in terms of next-generation biotech research, but also literally biomanufacturing around much cheaper production of insulin. I think one of the things that came out of the law we passed last year, the IRA, that basically said insulin for seniors shouldn't exceed $35 a month. This facility is trying to produce insulin at $30 a month. And as somebody who's the father of a diabetic daughter, type 1 diabetic daughter, I've been blessed enough to be able to afford to pay. But my daughter has seen in the 20 plus years that she's had to take insulin on a regular basis, the prices of that insulin quadruple. That is crazy. No other country pays at these levels, so we need both the kind of legal drug price negotiation, but we also need these next generation production facilities that are literally being built out in Petersburg. So the fact that we got 2 of the 31 tech hub guarantees was a great win for Virginia. We weren't successful on a small modular nuclear hub. I still believe that SMRs, particularly with our concentration of SMR and nuclear knowledge in Lynchburg, has to be part of our energy mix. And I'm going to continue to work with the governor and others to make sure that we get an SMR facility, which will still be one of the first in the world, somewhere in Virginia as we move forward. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Laura? I'm happy to take your questions.
Senator, our first question will be Mitchell Miller with WTOP. Mitchell? Okay, we're going to move on to Michael Martz with the RTD.
Yes, Senator Michael Martz. How are you today?
Good, fine.
Good. My question is, does the election of a speaker cause concern about a government shutdown to go away? And how does it affect the chances of reaching a spending agreement or another CR before November 17?
Well, Michael, I just met with the Italian Intelligence Committee, and we talked about China and Russia and geopolitical concerns. They asked me about what was going on in the House, and I glibly said that's classified, but the truth would be I don't have the foggiest idea. I do worry about the Speaker's record as a backbenching congressman. He was, for keeping governments open. He was one of the ones who seemed to be willing to shut down at a drop of the hat. He's been against funding for Ukraine. He is not for women's health care choices. I mean, you go down the litany of issues, what his prior positions have been, and it doesn't give me a lot of hope. Now, the flip side is I owe him as the benefit to prove me wrong, and maybe rising into this position will make sure that he will actually get the people's business done, which is don't shut down the government and make sure that we provide this support package for Israel, Ukraine, our friends in Asia in a unified way, because in a unified way it will get the vast majority of votes coming out of both the House and the Senate.
Senator, our next question is Sean Davis with Wavy News.
Hey, good afternoon, Senator.
Hey.
I just wanted to see if you could expand a little bit on what you started with. How are you conceptualizing this issue in Israel-Palestine, where a key U.S. ally was the victim of a horrific set of terrorist attacks, and that same U.S. ally is now causing a dire humanitarian situation that affects 2 million people? How are you conceptualizing that? What do you think the best case scenario for this conflict is? Is a ceasefire possible?
I think, first of all, we need to be crystal clear that the Middle East is in the position it is today because Hamas on October 7th brutally broke into Israel, murdered, butchered over 1,400 Israelis, took hundreds of women and children, soldiers, hostage. And Hamas is an organization that was, I believe, hated by most of the Palestinians in Gaza. And so I believe Israel has not only a right to defend itself, but when you are living this close to an organization that, by the way, does not accept even the two-state solution that most other nations in the region, most Arab nations in the region, are actually supportive of. Their only political objective is to push all the Israelis into the sea. That is an untenable position. And I think Israel has the right to go in and eradicate as much as possible the Hamas leadership, at least. At the same time, I think it's important that Israel operates within the rules of warfare. There are such a thing, which means no disproportionate harm to civilians. It means getting supplies, again, to some of the folks who are most in need. Remember, Israel was willing to send in supplies, a couple days into this. It was Hamas who was unwilling to let those trucks roll. And rightfully, I think the Americans, I believe even the Egyptians as well as the Israelis, were concerned that if these trucks of aid rolled and simply fell into the hands of Hamas, a terrorist organization, there was no guarantee that would get to the Palestinians in Gaza. So I think Israel needs to operate within the rules of war. And I think one of the things that I give the president a lot of credit for, the fact that he went within a few days of the tragedy into an active combat location, reaffirmed the United States' support for Israel. But what I think he did that was the bravest was he was willing to acknowledge that in the aftermath of 9/11, when Americans were just like Israelis are now, angry, rightfully justifiable anger about the brutal terrorists who had attacked on 9/11, Israel had the same honest, brutal anger against Hamas. But he said, we in America maybe overdid because we didn't have clear enough plans. We ended up in a 20-plus year war in Iraq. We ended up in a 20-plus year war in Afghanistan. So the willingness of a president of the United States to acknowledge in a foreign country that, hey, at our moment of crisis, we didn't think long and hard enough about what our objectives are, and to acknowledge that, I thought was enormously courageous. And it appears that it's having some effect that at least the Israelis are thinking through a strategy. Their ability and their military power to take back part of Gaza is not in question. But the real question becomes, what do you do after that? How do you, at the end of the day, bring some level of governance back to Gaza that's not going to be Hamas? And my hope and prayer is that what's been happening over these last few days is that there's been a lot of thinking, contacting, and planning about what happens after the shooting stops.
Senator, our next question is Felicity Taylor with CBS 19.
Hey, Senator. My question is, what can you do in the Senate to avoid a shutdown?
Well, what I can do in the Senate to avoid a shutdown is do my job. And doing my job means voting for a spending package that keeps the government operating. It means adhering to the deal that was cut between the president, the former Speaker of the House that had the majority leader and the minority leader of the Senate sign on. That was a framework that all of the quote-unquote major players agreed to. Let's stick to the deal. And I think the Senate will do that. And we're working through one of our, we've got, I think, 11 or 12 appropriations bills. We're working through 3 of them right now in what's called a minibus. Only kind of Washington speak would call it that. But we do our job. The House has got to do its. But the idea that the House is going to somehow come up with some crazy set of demands that might not even be dictated by the House leadership, but might be dictated by the former president as he travels from one of his indictments to another. That kind of notion that the government of the United States and the legislature of the United States ought to be listening to demands from a former president, that is not a way to keep the government open.
Senator, our next question is Jad Khalil with Virginia Public Media.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for taking our questions. These weekly things are really invaluable for the listeners. I wanted to ask you. You were talking about Israel needing to operate within the rules of war. There's been a really a very high number of casualties. There's been the tightening of food and fuel and those sort of things. To what extent do you think Israel is operating within the rules of war? And how are you making sure that the administration or Congress is communicating to the Israelis about sort of U.S. preferences on that?
Well, I think they are communicating on a daily basis. I know as I speak to my friends who are very active in the pro-Israel movement in this country and from Israel, I make the case, one, we got to minimize civilian casualties, and two, and I said this to all my friends who are supportive of aid to Israel, this whole package the president has put forward, and I've not heard anybody say they're doing this yet, but some Republican members are saying, hey, we'll do Israel, but to heck with Ukraine. That's just not a tenable circumstance. To throw over the Ukrainians 18 months in after they have literally beaten the Russian army time and again, to throw over Ukraine when we've had other nation states join NATO because of our partnership would do irreparable harm to America, as well as the fact, and this is the thing that makes me particularly crazy, is that I got guys that say, well, I don't care about Putin, but I'm really worried about President Xi. Well, you give Putin a win, that gives President Xi more license in his neighborhood. In terms of the ability to minimize casualties, I'd like to see these numbers lower. But when Hamas so heartlessly puts their missiles, sometimes firing from the roofs of inhabited houses, or stores their munitions in a mosque or in a populated building, I think it demonstrates the inhumanity of Hamas, that if they cared, if this is an organization that says it wants to fight against Israel, yet they use their very own Palestinian citizens as shields, it's disgraceful. It's one of the reasons why I think as history will ultimately write, that one of the things that motivated Hamas to act at this moment in time is that everyday Palestinians in Gaza were so sick of Hamas that Hamas might lose their ability to rule, and with that rule was enormous graft that the Hamas leadership would skim off from international aid coming in. So yes, I think Israel will try to minimize, but we got to realize they're not dealing with a civilized enemy. A civilized enemy would not put the people that they claim to represent in such harm's way.
Senator, our next question is Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood. I'm sorry, we have to move on to our next question. Amy Knowles.
Our questions. I'd like to circle back to the Tyson situation. If there are any Virginians across the Commonwealth who know of or suspect that a company has hired underage employees, why is it important that they come forward with that information, and who should they contact?
Well, I think they should contact, at the federal level, the state level, the Departments of Labor, Child Protective Services. If they don't feel like they're getting answers, they ought to contact my office or Senator Kane's office. There is a reason why we have minimum age working standards. You put people in harm's way. The stories we've seen, some in Virginia, mostly more in the Midwest, where kids are mangled operating on machines that are built for adult bodies, but a child tries to operate and they get sometimes grievously harmed. And we need to send a strong signal that we are going to enforce child labor laws. And if you're a large company, or for that matter, a small company, and you're hiring a 10 or 11-year-old to do work that you shouldn't qualify for unless you're over 16, that ought to be a problem, and you ought to be called out.
Senator, we're going to try Mitchell Miller with WTOP one more time. Mitchell? Okay, that was all the questions we had. Thanks, Senator.
All right, thank you all very much, everybody. And, it's going to buckle up the next couple of weeks, both internationally and as we approach the insanity of a potential another government shutdown. I think back in terms of a few weeks ago, one of the most meaningful meetings I had was with the folks that do ship repair down in Hampton Roads. When they take you through all of the problems that happen when you have to gear up for a shutdown, and believe you me, they don't get reimbursed. These are private contractors. Or the fact that if even what we've got right now, the so-called continuing resolution, that means you have to spend on exactly the same programs you spent on last year. Well, if your ship got repaired by September 30th and you were ready to bring in a new ship to work on, but you're operating on what's called this CR, continuing resolution, you can't do your work. So I can't think of anything more irresponsible. It's one of the reasons why, even to the chagrin of most of the folks in my party, I voted for legislation today that would have an automatic extension on what's called the CR, not a perfect solution. We ought to give a full budget, but to make sure that we don't put people's lives in jeopardy. Because when we do shut down, even though federal employees will ultimately be repaid, we put a whole lot of other people's lives in jeopardy. We put private sector contractors. We put the fact that often our air traffic controllers become overworked, means less safe skies. I know I got a letter from a young woman who had planned for over a year to have a marriage in this beautiful place. She invited all her family in the Shenandoah Valley, in the national park. Luckily, we didn't shut down that Saturday. If we'd shut down that Saturday, her wedding on Sunday wouldn't have come to pass. Now, does that mean somebody died? No, but it does mean literally thousands of dollars that were spent on preparing that event go out the window, and on top of that, a most joyous day of somebody's life becomes not a washout, but a politician fallout. And frankly, Virginians and Americans deserve better. Thanks, everybody.